Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm just doing a quick weekly wrap up of the books that I've read this week, as weekly wrap up would suggest. And just as a quick heads up, I'm going to be dog sitting from here on out for about a week or so. And so my next wrap up will be in a couple of weeks' time. I've got some other videos kind of sort of scheduled for that time, but I don't know yet what the filming situation will be like there, so or how easy it'll be to edit. So I'm just gonna skip a week and you'll have something else instead. Anyhow, let's go on to talk about the books that I've read this week. So first up is Blurb Your Enthusiasm by Louise Wilder. And so I really enjoyed this. This is basically a bit of, in some ways, a bit of a history and sort of a current sort of focus on what it looks like to write blurbs for books. And so Louise Wilder has done this for many books over the years, and this is almost a bit of her introduction to that world. So she goes through what blurbs used to look like, what the purposes of blurbs are, some really good ones, some really bad ones, and kind of the rules that normally govern what makes a good or a bad blurb. And she does obviously acknowledge that there are many times where this is sort of broken, but she talks about, you know, some sort of blurbs really tend to go overboard with kind of being like, you know, never been seen before, brand new thing, reminiscent of this author, all that kind of stuff. And she says actually the really effective ones are the ones that kind of capture the voice of the book, or really sort of show instead of telling. You know, instead of telling you that this is a funny book, why not show a passage that's funny, or write something in the, you know, in the voice of it that is funny. And she gives some examples of sort of books that talk about, you know, a laugh on every page that she read and hated and found completely not funny in the slightest. So a really interesting book, and one of those sort of nice books that sort of just someone within the book industry talking about their love of books and their love of how sort of books come to be written or sold, I guess, in this case. And so a really fun little book that I kind of would recommend. I did think it sort of went on a little bit long at one point, where I was sort of like, okay, we're still here. But it's a really fun and enjoyable read nonetheless. It's sort of, you know, you can tell she loves what she does, and that really sort of shines through on every page. Next up, I read Liberation Day by George Saunders. And so this is a collection of his short stories, recently released, as I should have said, was sort of Blurb Your Enthusiasm. And this book, I haven't actually read any of George Saunders' short stories before. I've read Lincoln in the Bardo, which I adore, but actually never really sort of gone in and read some of his short stories. And he's very sort of, this collection at least is very kind of bizarre and fun. You've got kind of quite a lot of characters who are just a little bit, I mean, idiosyncratic feels like a very sort of democratic way of talking about them. They are often quite strange characters, sort of doing quite odd things. And we've got quite a variety of almost genres going on. There are some bits that feel almost sci-fi, like the first story in this collection talks a lot about this land where language has been sort of transformed. And so that's sort of a bit more sci-fi. We've got some that feel like they engage a little bit more with politics, some that engage a bit more with the sort of everyman kind of character. So yeah, just quite weird and wonderful. I don't think I sort of ever really fully loved any story. I enjoyed it overall as a collection. But I think I do want to dig into a few more of his. I've heard 10th of December is particularly good. But his writing style is always just really fun. There's something very, he's very good at kind of picking out the kind of idiosyncrasies of how people talk, and their sort of mannerisms and all of these sorts of things, and kind of creating characters through just this sort of weird speech patterns, or through these other sort of strange things. So I really greatly enjoyed this. But yeah, I think I feel like I need another collection of his to sort of fully kind of get how I feel about his short stories, but enjoyable nonetheless. Next up, from the author who brought you Plek, or There Are More Things, Yara Rodrigues Fowler, I read Stubborn Archivist, which is her first novel. And this, in many ways, does a few similar things to There Are More Things in terms of the writing style, in terms of how she approaches various things. And there's something really engaging about that for me. It's told in this very, very kind of chatty conversational style where often, let's sort of try and see if I can find an example, you sort of got a lot of pages with either bits of blank text or, sort of fairly blank, or kind of, it's very kind of chatty. This is almost sort of dialogue heavy at times. And it's often a lot of wordplay, kind of in an Ali Smith kind of vein of characters sort of jumping around and sort of saying a certain thing and then breaking it down. But at the heart of it, really what's going on in this book is a relationship between cultures, basically, of a young Brazilian woman in South London who's sort of balancing being a Londoner now and kind of balancing that with her family in Brazil. And so when they come to visit, there are all these sort of little things that they observe that she sort of tries to guide them through, basically. Sort of, oh yeah, here's how you sort of survive in London or in the UK or in, sort of the culture more generally. But actually, at the heart of it, I think there's something really quite profound going on. I think it almost feels easy at the beginning of this book to just think it's going to be this sort of really light-hearted, chatty, not particularly deep kind of thing, just because you go through many pages with just sort of like silly little conversations between people. But actually, as this book builds, I think there's something really quite powerful going on that occasionally I found actually really quite moving, around how kind of those little conversations between people and sort of families, and actually those little almost catchphrases that people have in families, how those remind you of certain things, how they kind of show where somebody's at and what they're thinking, but also how you miss them when they're gone. And so I found this a really, really profound book in many, many ways, and just thought there are some really interesting discussions going on here, despite what at first feels a bit more frivolous and a bit sillier. And it's just, yeah, really quite touching particularly when it gets onto some of the sort of relationships between family members in a really beautiful way. And last but not least, the next book I read was Maggie O'Farrell's The Marriage Portrait. And I've been really, really keen to read this. I loved Hamnet, and was really, really excited to read more by her. I've still not actually read any other books, thinking about it, outside of Hamnet in this. But essentially this... The sort of inspiration for this for Maggie O'Farrell comes from seeing sort of some old kind of classical paintings, and particularly this one quite striking image of this young girl who was married to a duke. And this sort of story then builds from there, where we have Lucrezia, who right from the beginning of this book is we sort of are basically sort of put right in the middle of it, kind of in media res, right from the beginning, that she is convinced that she is about to be murdered by her husband, the Duke of Ferrara. And so she is completely obsessed with this idea. And at first, I think we're meant to sort of be somewhere on the line of thinking it's a bit paranoid potentially, but there may be some truth in it. And particularly because Maggie O'Farrell at the beginning hedges a lot of this on the idea of My Last Duchess, the Browning poem. And so we kind of have this sort of thing of like, okay, let's see how this pans out. But I think what's actually really just beautiful about what happens next really is that we follow the kind of inner lives of all of these people, but particularly young Lucrezia, in kind of the midst of kind of court drama. So, in the land of the, in a kind of court, the royal court, you have to find ways of surviving despite all of the kind of challenges that go on around you, right? And so sometimes those challenges can be that you've not established enough of a power base. It might be that you trust the wrong people. It might be that somebody else is incredibly power hungry and is going to try and topple you. All of these sorts of things. And really what then happens in this book, which I think is really profound, is we get a lot of insights into the inner lives of these characters. I think I'll do a separate book review on this, just because I think there's a lot to say about it. But I really, really enjoyed this. The writing is gorgeous and sumptuous, and we get a lot of the inner lives of these characters, particularly, mostly through Lucrezia's eyes, but we learn a lot about how she sort of navigates this sort of court, world, and particularly, going into it at sort of 13, 14 years old. You know, she knows sort of from a young age that she's going to be sort of prepped for this, but in many ways this happens earlier than she's expecting. And she's married at a really young age. There's a whole thing about her almost having to wait for her first period to be married to the Duke, and therefore as a result we kind of get this really interesting insight into her blossoming into a woman, but also at the same time having to go through this whole thing of playing a political game, which she doesn't at first seem particularly set up for, but manages just about. I think it's a really well done book, and there are some scenes in this that I thought were breathtaking in terms of the observations of them. There's a sort of 3 or 4 page passage where she's about to have sex for the first time, and it's done in this really brilliant way of sort of identifying almost what would she be thinking as a basically a young girl at this point, you know, like a teenager, trying to navigate not only sex for the first time when she's not really been told much about it, but also knowing that she's sort of playing a political game at the same time. It's a really, really interesting book, and I really loved it and really highly recommend it. And that's been me for this week. I've really enjoyed these books. It's been a good fun one. And yeah, like I mentioned, I will, there'll sort of be a little bit of a pause on the weekly roundups. There'll be a different video in its place next Sunday, but I will be dog sitting, so I'll be looking after a little dog and trying not to get chewed. That's my life now. Take care and speak to you all soon. I hope you have a great week. Bye bye.